Well, in deference to those who were prompt and in due respect to their time, why don't we get the meeting underway, and a few more may join us as we go along. I'll start with the warning for this evening's event. The legal voters of the Addison Central School District are hereby notified of the virtual public information hearing on Tuesday, February 23rd, 2021 at 7 p.m. to discuss Australian ballot articles warned for vote on Tuesday, March 2nd, 2021. We have with us tonight, of course, our Superintendent of Schools and Zoom Meister, Dr. Peter Burrows. Our District Clerk, Linda Barrett, is here recording the discussion tonight. Our school board is with us. Betty Kafumbe, Jen Newseeder, Mary Cullinane, the board chair, Mary Gill, Jory Jacobite, Victoria Jetty, Peter Conlon, Davina Desmarais, Chip Malcolm, Lorraine Morse, Peg Martin, Amy McGlashan, and Suzanne Buck. We appreciate their hard work on our behalf. Our purpose tonight is to offer a chance for the administration to present the proposed budget for fiscal year 2022 and then entertain your questions about it, along with a couple of related financial articles. The process with which many of you are more familiar than I, no doubt, is to push that little raise hand button if you have a question after the presentation is over, and I'll call on folks as I see their raised hands come up. And we hope and expect that it will go very smoothly. So any questions about that process? Pretty straightforward, and our superintendent will make sure that you're able to unmute yourself at the appropriate time when you're invited to speak.
We may have a question here about the process. Tanya's hand's been up from the beginning. I'm going to ask her to unmute. Is that okay?
Yeah, Tanya, sure.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thanks so much. The link on the ACSD website, when you go, there's a notification message that pops up and gives you all the details for the meetings, and that link is not working to join the meeting. So I just wanted to let you know that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Wow.
I saw Sharon on here somewhere, so, and maybe Erica too, they could get on there and move it to the calendar invite.
Great. Thank you, Tanya, for raising that. Well, let me read the articles that we'll be voting on March 2nd, and then invite our team to make their presentation. Article 1 is to see if the voters of the Addison Central School District will vote to authorize its board of directors under 16 VSA section 562(9) to borrow money by issuance of bonds or notes not in excess of anticipated revenue for the school year. Article 2 is shall the voters of the Addison Central School District vote to authorize the ACSD school board to expend $40,352,941, which is the amount the ACSD school board has determined to be necessary for the ensuing fiscal year. It is estimated that the proposed budget, if approved, will result in education spending of $18,936.57 per equalized pupil. This projected spending per equalized pupil is 0.34% higher than spending for the current year. Article 3, shall the voters of the Addison Central School District vote to authorize the ACSD school board to appropriate $623,744 of the FY 2020 unassigned fund balance, estimated at $1,173,744 to the ACSD Capital Reserve Fund. So those are the three budgetary related items that will be on our ballot when we go to our individual town voting places on the 2nd. And I'll turn it over to Peter Burrows at this. Well, let me ask Mary Cullinane first, if our chair, if you'd like to make a few opening remarks as we get into this discussion on our budget.
Great. Thank you very much, Governor. And thank you to everyone who has joined. It's great to see, even despite the constraints that we have with regards to COVID, the participation of our community members. It's important given this topic, and we as the board appreciate the contributions that you have provided and continue to provide as we work through our challenges. I'd also like to thank in advance Governor, for your leadership here as we go through our meeting tonight. We appreciate that as always. And then finally, thank the district leadership who has been working hard, putting together the proposals that we will see this evening. This is not easy work. These are not easy times. These challenges are real, but together as a community, we are confident that we will be able to see a path forward. So with that, Peter Burrows.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to just share a little bit of the overview of the budget, the context, how we approached it, and then I'm going to hand it off to Brittany Gilman, who was a leader in developing this, and she's going to take us through the budget book and really kind of dig into some of the detail that we've been sharing over the budget meetings we've had over the last few months. As all of you know, we went into this budget in an unprecedented reality with lots of tension and challenge, both locally and nationally. And as we moved towards the budget, we had lots and lots of communication from the state about things that we might be able to predict, things that we can't predict. I think starting in the summer, this budget was, as you know, developed kind of from the end of the summer through to December. We heard a lot of siren calls about the bottom falling out, about state revenue being a real challenge to the Ed Fund. And so superintendents across the state were highly concerned about what kind of parameters would be placed on the FY22 budget. And we're thinking through and talking about how are we going to respond if we get information, and unfortunately, oftentimes we get information in the 11th hour where we have to act really quickly, and often it's challenging to make big, significant changes with 2 weeks or a month to go. So there was a lot of noise, I think, statewide about what could happen. Fortunately, as we got closer and closer to budget season and receiving the numbers that drive our budget, so we talk about the term equalized pupil. That's a kind of a wonky term, but it essentially means the number of students. It's a weighted number of students that provides a certain level of funding for our school district. So as we moved closer to getting those numbers in December, it was clear that the initial thinking around what the impact was going to be of the pandemic on state revenue and specifically on ed funding and budget was far greater. There was more concern. It wasn't, the picture was much brighter. That has continued through this process. So kind of a silver lining is, what eventually we shared with all of you in December around tax rates has changed pretty significantly. Brittany will go into the details there, but with the yield rate, the tax yield, this is a number basically set by the state to gather taxes. And if state revenues are high, that yield goes up, our taxes go down. So there's good news on that front, and we'll be sharing those revised tax numbers with all of you. Numbers are significantly different. So that's, I think, a real positive in FY22 is due to online shopping and all sorts of other things, the economy didn't get hit in the way that legislators thought it might. The other silver lining to FY22 and FY23 is that federal funds are starting to flow into the state. We are receiving ESSER funds, they're called, ESSER. I think it's an acronym for something, I'm not sure what. And we're going to receive a few different stages of ESSER funds. Those funds are going to enable us, they're not necessarily helping the state backfill revenue, but they are helping districts with the recovery planning that we're doing as we come out of the pandemic and look at learning loss and the needs that all of our students have, which we know are really varied, and we're leaning into that work right now in both building a plan and starting to assess and gather data to know exactly where we stand. That money will be helping us, and potentially in places where we have to reduce, we may be able to fill in. So we're working on our first ESSER-1 right now. That's coming this spring in terms of submitting that, and we have like over a year to spend those funds. 2 is following, I believe, in the fall, and then 3 is being talked about right now. So that's another, I think, positive for the state, and especially for districts, to be looking at providing additional support for students, looking at after school programming, looking at some of the things that we talk about that we haven't been able to do, sometimes due to either scale or resources or capacity in terms of staffing, that we're going to be able to be thinking about and looking at. Those are one-time funds. Those aren't continual funds. So we're not going to be building programming that we're expecting to run for 10 years with those same funds. So it isn't something that we're going to have long-term. I think the goals of this budget, of the FY22 budget, the big thing and the thing that we've been talking about most is the 6th grade move. So we've spent a lot of time working through what staffing should look like. Again, having a long-term plan for that, and looking not just to this year, but looking ahead to, what kinds of structures do we need to put in place to adapt to our current reality. So that's a big part of this budget. The other thing that we spent a lot of time over the last few months in discussing with our community is the excess spending threshold. And the fact that this budget has pushed us over the excess spending threshold, and that threshold is a ceiling that the state creates to suppress spending for districts. And when you spend over that threshold, you are double taxed for every dollar over that ceiling that the state sets. So it's something that you've probably heard about in previous budget presentations. You don't need to study it greatly. Just know that it's a vehicle that the state uses in ed funding to basically try to support budgets that communities can support and afford. One thing I want to mention in terms of what that does, the board had a lot of communication, or a lot of discussion rather, about the excess spending threshold and looking at our unanticipated fund balance or unassigned fund balance to consider, do we spend some of that fund balance to pay down essentially the amount of money that we're over that threshold, that ceiling, so that we're not double taxed. And the board, one of the articles that Governor Douglas read is, you can see, is the $600,000 is to spend down. The other part of that $600,000 rather is money that's going into the budget from the fund balance to pay down that threshold. As we look ahead, and we've been talking about planning and not just budgeting for today, but budgeting for tomorrow as well, is being prepared for, as that threshold grows higher, or another vehicle comes into play as the state starts their weighting study and starts to implement the weighting study, that we're prepared and we're thinking about that. We know that year to year, we can't be using our ending fund balance to try to pay down the amount we're over the threshold, because this year, if we're 500,000 over, next year we're 1.5 over. And soon we're not going to be able to contain that. So it's important. I think we're in a good place now to be able to respond to that. I expect that FY23 will be a challenging budget just because of that reality. The weighting study that I mentioned has a negative tax impact on our communities, and and many communities in Vermont, and some gain and some are taxed higher based on those new weights. That's something that probably we will be contending with in FY23. So a year from now, as we're talking about the budget, we'll be talking through how do we respond to that. The legislature right now is talking about a slightly different funding formula, looking at the threshold and figuring out, well, how does that work with the weighting study? Does it work or not? Again, lots that we know and lots that we don't know, and we'll continue to put students first. That's a #1 priority. I want to now pass it off to Brittany, and I'm hoping that she can share her screen. It worked. Okay. I think I need to, she needs to. Brittany, I'm trying to find you to unmute you.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Peter?
I can, yep.
Okay, sorry, I minimized my window. So hello, everybody. This is the ACSD FY22 budget presentation. And now I can't, there we go. You know, Peter already spent a fair bit of time reflecting on the challenges of the current year and preparing for the future. Just to give you some perspective for what the process has looked like. So I won't belabor that, but you know, some of the things that he mentioned and some he didn't mention. So obviously the 6th grade move to MUMS was, you know, a big moving piece in the budget this year. This is probably the first budget or the budget where we've had really the most movement and changes in terms of structure and staffing since we became a unified district. Health insurance premiums again are up, so they increased 9.8% this year. Last year they were over 10, so that's a major driver. We're entering our first full budget year of the statewide collective bargaining healthcare benefits, so we're still, you know, gathering data about what the sort of long-term effects of that might be, and if the first year or the half year that we experienced was really representative of what that looks like. Peter mentioned the excess spending threshold. In a normal year, that would increase, you know, between 2 and 3%, usually around 2.5% is what I would anticipate. And this year it only increased 0.18%. So that was really difficult, especially for districts like us that were kind of bumping up against it. We'll talk more about the property yield, and Peter mentioned that in terms of early on in the budget, thinking that the property yield was going to be pretty substantially down, and it painted a pretty grim picture of the budget when we first started talking about it. And then as the budget cycle progressed, you know, we thought it would be about level, and now it's looking like it's going to be an increase. So that has really helped. And then the CLA, and we'll talk more about that, that stands for Common Level of Appraisal, and every town has its own CLA. The district has one tax rate, but then it's affected by the CLA. So we saw some towns have some, you know, some pretty substantial decreases in CLA, which affected the town tax rate. So we'll talk about that soon. I also wanted to note that this is our first budget year. So FY22 will be our first budget year with a new statewide uniform chart of accounts. So it's not as evident when you're looking at the district summary, but when you're starting to look at some of the school specific summaries and the detail in the budget book, when you're looking at line items that to begin with were only, you know, 40 or 50 or even $100,000, it can make it look like there was a major change when there wasn't. And I tried to call that out in the budget book, which things were due to coding. So that's just something to be aware of. It's a little bit difficult to compare, and it was a little bit of a challenge to budget and looking and making sure that things made sense. But as you know, as we are in the uniform chart of accounts and we enter our second and third year, it'll be much easier to compare. And actually, interestingly, it'll be easier to compare to other districts as well, because we'll all be using the same coding, whereas before it was pretty disparate and there were some really different ways that we categorized expenses. So, you know, just to let you know, when you're looking at particularly smaller line items, it can make it look like there was a really big change, and the changes really are likely due to coding, and in some cases it's shifting, you know, what's covered by a grant and what's not covered by a grant, or even especially in these line items where there's one person who is you know, making up the bulk of that expenses, they selected a different benefit or something like that. So it can just kind of make the data look skewed. So just to call that out. So I wanted to start talking about the summary of changes for staffing. And so in terms of elementary staffing related to the 6th grade move, we're seeing a reduction of 7 licensed positions at the elementary school. And we'll talk about where those are coming from and sort of what that looks like in terms of the number of classrooms at the elementary level. And then partially as a result of the 6th grade move, and then also just related to the services that students need, we're anticipating a reduction of 7 support staff, but we anticipate that those positions will be reduced through attrition. So we're not anticipating rifts due to some vacancies that already exist. And then in terms of secondary staffing, there's an increase of 1.4 licensed positions, and that's related to 6th grade moving to MUMS. And I'll give you an overview of what that looks like. There have been some pretty detailed presentations about it from the folks over at MUMS, but I did want to talk about it a little bit. But first, to talk about the classrooms at the elementary level. So what you're seeing here, current FY21, that's the number of classrooms, or you know, the number of teachers, for example, that they have now, and then proposed for FY22. One thing I want to say, especially for principals that are looking at these numbers, is the current FY21 can sometimes be skewed if you have a teacher who was assigned to a remote academy. So this was sort of budget to budget, the way that we're looking at things. So one way to look at this is right now Bridport has 5 classrooms, so they have some mixed grades. They're going to maintain 5 classrooms because there was a blend that was too large to be a blend, so we had to split it. So the same thing with Cornwall and Shoreham. Mary Hogan, Ripton, Salisbury, and Weybridge are all reducing the number of classrooms that they have. And again, this is related to the 6th grade move. So in Mary Hogan's case, you know, it's related, they have a standalone 6th grade. Some of the other schools like Ripton and Weybridge have a, you know, like combined grade. So we had to look at how to shift those configurations, you know, moving from a K1 or to a 1-2 or whatever that needed to be. And then also just looking at how pre-K fits into that, and, you know, looking at a district vision for that. So the total reduction here is 7 licensed staff. Some highlights from the 6th grade move, as I said, that has, there have been some pretty detailed presentations about that. But the general overview is that there's 1 team per grade level. So right now there's, excuse me, 2 teams per grade level. And those are the, you know, Lang and Lit, math, individuals, and societies. I list math twice. Very important. So those are the areas that will have, you know, specific assigned to them, to the team. And then, you know, in looking at the needs of the middle school model and how it fits with IB, there's increased guidance, increased world language, and increased music to make that move to the 6th, for the 6th grade work. We're looking at class sizes not to exceed 20 students, with about 120 students per team. As I said, the teams are grade levels, so 6th grade team, 7th grade team, 8th grade team. And those increases, you know, we're going from 4 to 3 teams, and then increasing some of the areas like guidance and world language. So all that nets to the 1.4. Some non-wage and benefits highlights. So I just wanted to go through some of the areas in the budget book that you might be seeing a big change and you're wondering, you know, why that occurred. So for special education, there are no FTE changes beyond the changes that we discussed for support staff. So in some cases, there were support staff that had a percentage of them that was assigned to special education this past year. So in not filling those vacancies, there's a reduction there. We did have to increase some of our related services. So occupational therapy and physical therapy, we're seeing an increased need for that. But we've seen a pretty drastic decline in out-of-district tuition and special education transportation. So that's really driving the decrease there. There's also just kind of a, there are certain things that can be categorized as reimbursable for special education and certain things that can't. So we're always kind of working with the balance there and seeing what's eligible and what's not. So some things get pulled out into regular education, direct instruction. For transportation, just a reminder that we're still in a 5-year escalating contract. We have realized some savings by reducing a duplicative route, but we're experiencing the increases that we negotiated. If you recall, when we went out to bid a few years ago, it was a lovely welcoming gift for me when I joined the district to come into a bid of, from one vendor. And it was a pretty stark increase, I think 40% that we negotiated down to be able to make it more manageable to build into our budgets. Under debt service, that's decreased quite a bit. Mary Hogan and Shoreham both retired bonds. So that freed up, that gave us a little breathing room. And then I also just wanted to note that we're budgeting an increase in our nurse equipment. So we're budgeting AEDs for all schools. I will not be able to tell you what that stands for, but somebody will be able to. But there was, a lot of discussion about how can we continue to make our schools safer, and what equipment do we need that we don't have or that's outdated. So in conversation with the nurses, we've gotten to work with them much more closely this year as a result of the pandemic. And so we built that into the budget. We felt that that was really important. In terms of our reserve funds, as Peter mentioned, we have an unaudited fund balance. So our audit is still going on, but we're anticipating that our fund balance from FY20 is about 1.1 million. And so we're proposing using $550,000 of that toward reducing the FY22 tax rate and avoiding excess spending threshold penalties. And we will discuss that a little bit more when we get into the tax rate. And then the remainder is proposed to go to the capital projects fund, which, as you can see, is at a zero balance right now. We still have our education reserve fund, which has almost $1.9 million in it. And then our healthcare reserve fund, which has $200,000 in it. And that was established when we first implemented HRAs, which are health reimbursement accounts. And we didn't feel like we had, we definitely didn't have the data that we needed to know how to budget for that. So we felt like it was, the board and the administration at the time felt like it was important to establish that so that if we were coming in far over our allocation, we could utilize those funds. To date, we haven't need to. We've maintained that fund in light of the new statewide healthcare bargaining agreements, because it was another change that we don't feel that we have good historical data in order to budget. So we're keeping that. So getting into the FY22 tax rate calculation, this is a table of the components of what goes into the tax rate and what effect these components have on the tax rate when they increase. So some of these feel really obvious and intuitive. So our expenditure budget is just our total district expenditures. And as that goes up, obviously our tax rate increases. Our local revenues are things like grants and tuition income. We sometimes have, rental income, miscellaneous income. And as that increases, it decreases our tax rate because it reduces our education spending, which is just our expenditures less our local revenue. As that goes up, our tax rate goes up. Next is our equalized pupils, and I think that's where the intuitive nature of this formula ends. So we've talked about this a lot, and it's essentially a weighted 2-year average of enrollment. It does not always correlate directly with enrollment because of the weight that is assigned to certain types of pupils. So high school students are weighted up and pre-K students are weighted down. We receive additional weighting for students experiencing poverty and also students who are English language learners. So, one of the interesting things about this year is that the legislature passed a freeze on our ADM, which is our average daily membership. So that's a component of equalized pupils. Equalized pupils is essentially a weighted 2-year average of ADM. And so the goal there was to mitigate reductions in enrollment as a result of COVID, as a result of the pandemic. So trying to avoid seeing a really sharp decline in equalized pupils as a result of decreased enrollment. We still did see a small decline in equalized pupils, and that's largely related, to the weighting. It also is related to the fact that it's a 2-year average. So 1 year is dropping off that was higher than last year. And then also just the weighting changes for things like poverty and the number of high school students we have and the number of English language learners that we have. So it doesn't always, it's not a 1-to-1. And as our equalized pupils increase, it causes our tax rate to go down because it's the denominator in education spending per equalized pupil. So that's really just our education spending divided by our equalized pupils. And that's the number that is in the warning. It's a number that we focus on a lot because it's what triggers the excess spending threshold. So if that number exceeds the excess spending threshold, then the portion that exceeds the threshold is double taxed. And that can have a pretty substantive effect on the tax rate depending on how far you're over. And once you're over it, it becomes really hard to get under. There are certain costs that are considered exempt from the excess spending threshold. So when you see what our education spending per equalized pupil is, it actually still exceeds the threshold. But because we have exemptions for things like debt and for VISTERS, which is Vermont State Teachers Retirement, certain special education expenditures, we're able to net that out so that we won't receive that penalty. So we just are taxed on that normally. And then the property yield is a mechanism which the state uses in order to collect the amount of money that it needs statewide. So we've talked at length about the fact that the funding system that we have is statewide. So the state raises all the money that it needs. And this is what, the primary mechanism, I think, or a major mechanism of how they do that. And they figure out, the total that they need to collect for the education fund. And this number is set accordingly. What we have, we get December 1st. It's a recommendation from the tax commissioner. And it often usually changes between December 1st and, May or June or whenever it's approved by the legislature. When we first started looking at the budget, we thought it was going to be a substantive decrease. So I think we were looking at, tax rate increases of 10 or 12 cents. But since that time, the current bill, the current yield bill that's in legislature has quite an increase, over 3% increase in the property yield. So that's really helped our tax rate. But, we often don't know exactly what that will be when we're talking about the budget, which can make it difficult. And then when you, divide your education spending per equalized pupil by your property yield, you get your tax rate. And this is the same for all towns in the district before the CLA is applied. And this is what our tax rate looks like. So our expenditure budget is up just under 1%, and our local revenues are up 8%. And a large component of that is the $550,000 of our fund balance that we've built in here. So this is how we reduce it. We put it in as a revenue. And essentially, when we plan to do that, we're planning to deficit spend. And that sounds like a scary thing, but a good illustration that I have used in the past is if you have $1,000 sitting in your checking account and you're getting $1,500 in your paycheck, but you have $2,000 in bills, your checking account is still positive. And that's how fund balance works. So we're saying we're going to use $550,000 that we haven't used from the prior year, and we'll have expenditures greater than revenues, and that will use that fund balance. That will use the checking account, so to speak. So our education spending is actually down about 0.5%. And that's related to some of the things we've already discussed. So the use of fund balance, the reduction in staff, the elimination of debt, those have all played in here to allow us to have a reduction in education spending. Our equalized pupils are down 0.64%. So this number is just slightly different than what was presented at our last board meeting. We gained for equalized pupils in another round of calculations by the AOE, which is going to cause our ed spending per equalized pupil to look just a little better than what it is in the warning. That's okay. The warning says that it's an estimate. And up until about 3 years ago, we would get our equalized pupils on December 15th, and that was it. They wouldn't change. But for the past 3 years, because of a new statewide data collection, it's very common for us to not get our equalized pupils numbers until after December 15th. And then we get, 4 or 5 or 10 iterations of that. But the final figure that we got was this 1,735. So that was a gain of 4 from our previous calculation, which gives us an education spending per equalized pupil of 18,882.88. So it's essentially level. It's a 0.06% increase, which is, I think, really responsible given the current environment. And then we're down in the property yield, which is, as I said, a 3.5% increase. So this is the number, as far as I know, that's currently being discussed in the legislature. So this was a big help for us. And that's giving us an equalized tax rate of 166. And then we still have an incentive rate. So that incentive rate was given to ACSD for voluntarily unifying, and the first year of that was FY18. So FY22 will be our last year. It goes down 2 cents every year till it's phased out. And that gives us a revised tax rate of $1.64. And that's a decrease of 4 cents or 2.38%. So remember, everyone in the district starts with this tax rate, and then the CLA is applied. So we're not going to incur excess spending threshold penalty because of the exemptions. It brings it below the excess spending threshold, which is 18,789. And as I said, this is a decrease of approximately 4 cents. So the common level of appraisal is unique to each town, and it considers property sales versus the grand list. It has really, we don't have any control over it as a school district. The towns, they can grieve it if they're not happy with that number. I think Cornwall did a couple of years ago. But the general way that this works is if your CLA is 100%, then your tax rate, your town tax rate, will be exactly the same as ACSD. If it's higher than 100%, which can happen, it helps your tax rate be lower than the district tax rate, and vice versa. If your CLA is under 100, then you're going to see a higher tax rate than the district tax rate. And something that's also really important to note is that decreases in CLA can lead to increases in the district tax rate that can be kind of shocking sometimes, especially if there's a big swing, which we did see for a couple of towns. So Bridport, Cornwall, Middlebury, and Weybridge and Salisbury all saw decreases. Ripton and Shoreham saw increases. And so the larger the decrease in your year-to-year CLA, the more that the town will feel it in terms of the tax rate. So Salisbury, for example, dropped by almost 6 points, I guess I'll call it. And so that is going to make their increase higher than a town that is actually seeing an increase in CLA like Ripton or Shoreham. And these are the estimated town tax rates. So you can see, I think initially when we started looking at this, we were thinking that, the highest might be 18 cents. Now we're looking at some towns that are seeing a reduction of 4 or 5 cents. Some towns are seeing, like Middlebury, just a 1 cent increase. And then Bridport, Cornwall, and Salisbury are seeing 3 and 7 cents respectively. And again, this is, related to the CLA. The other thing to note is that I'm rounding these to 2 decimal places. If you look them up on the state website, they round them to 4 decimal places. But I think it's easier to conceptualize. I personally don't think of money in terms of 4 decimal places. Maybe some people do, but I think it's easier to conceptualize when rounded to 2 decimal points. And then the effect that this has, if you're just looking at the district tax rate, the effect on a $300,000 home is approximately $112 in savings. And for the towns, it ranges anywhere from a savings of about $145 to an increase of $210. In terms of the way that the income sensitivity works, in our towns, we have, around 2/3, around 60% of folks that receive some sort of property tax credit or rebate as a result of income sensitivity. The current, the calculation for that is a little bit different. And the current income yield, which is different, it's like the property yield, isn't proposed to increase quite as much as the property yield. So it's looking like, a resident making $80,000 might see about a $20 increase, depending on, where that income yield ultimately lands, which feels a little counterintuitive, but it's the way things look right now. All right, that's it. I'm going to minimize my screen and stop sharing. It was very strange to be talking to my PowerPoint presentation. I couldn't see anybody's faces, and there was no verbal feedback. So
It was all positive, Brittany.
hopefully no one was waving their hands like, we can't hear you, you're frozen.
No, thanks so much for that explanation, and thank you, Peter, for your remarks as well. We'll open it up now to questions from voters. If you'd like to pose a question to Peter or Brittany, push that little raise hand thing on your screen, and I'll call on folks as I see them. Are there any questions about the budget or the other articles? Mr. Cox.
Yes, I have a question for Brittany. Thank you for that very concise and understandable budget report. I never thought I'd understand that much about the budget, but I do. Okay, so my question has to do with the fact that the 4-year-old program at Ripton School has been taken out of the budget for this coming year. And I noticed in our town report that for this year, it cost $27,208 for that program. And so it's being removed. And my question is, how much does that potential cost of the 4-year-old program for the coming year, how does that compare to the amount of money that's been spent for the services of Truex Collins up to this point?
I don't know the answer to that offhand, I'm sorry.
Is there anyone who knows how much has been spent for that architectural firm?
That number is over $100,000, I believe, over the course of the last 18 months.
Okay, so
we also have a number of other costs, not related to the master plan, but other curriculum costs. I mean, if you look through our budget, there are many costs in our budget that are well exceed that amount.
well, I don't doubt that. But I just want to pose the question if perhaps it might be worth it to retain the 4-year-old Ripton program, given that we're willing to spend 4 times that amount on the architectural firm. I'm just asking about priorities. Okay, thank you. That was my question.
Thank you. Chris Kramer.
Hi, Brittany. I think you may have touched on this in other board meetings, but could you summarize what the outcome, how the outcomes would look different if the fund balance weren't used, the $550,000, like on tax rates and things like that?
Oh, yes, I did go over that, and I need to look at it. If you will grant me a moment to pull up some of my documentation. Okay.
Chris, I'm just
I'm sorry, I just need to pull up my spreadsheet. Go ahead, Peter.
Sorry, I was just letting Chris know. It mutes and unmutes. I'm just trying to keep you the line open here.
Oh, okay. That was my question.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so at the time that we were going through the district tax rate scenarios, things looked a little different in terms of the yield and the equalized pupils. But at the time, we were looking at a difference of like 6 cents. That's changed a little bit because of the property yield, and I'd have to recalculate that. But I think that's what I presented. There was three scenarios. One was current, the other was use of $550,000 fund balance, and then another was just informational to see what it would look like without the excess spending threshold penalty. But it looks like it was about 6 cents.
Okay. I guess the question is just, since there are voters sort of participating, it seemed like higher level discussion items that took place at the board was whether to use the fund balance or not, and sort of giving a voter perspective to that as well. Just thinking about, okay, is that a good thing to do? Do we want to do that now or not? What the implications are of that. Yep.
Yeah, so 6 cents, which is $60, for moving decimal places in my head. But, thinking about the effect of $100,000 home, and then, we usually use $300,000. So the board definitely, you probably saw, we had a lot of discussions about that.
Right. Thank you.
Other questions of Brittany or Peter? Or comments about what they presented? Mr. Costin or Ms. Costin?
Hello, good evening. If I'm reading the tax rates right, the effective taxes are lower in the fiscal year 22 than they were in 2017. And I think the administration and board need to be congratulated to keep these low without violating the vision and mission statements. That's my.
Thank you, sir. Other comments or questions? Tanya.
Hi, I just had a general budget question, and I don't think it's part of this budget book, but would it be possible to see an in-depth analysis of the cost of the International Baccalaureate program? I know when we had voted on it, the focus was on the professional development budget and how that would compare, but seeing the amount of positions that have been added, like in IB coordinators and foreign language teachers, and I know more positions are being considered for future budget purposes. So I would just like to request that we could get an in-depth analysis of the cost of IB. Thank you.
Mary Heather Noble.
Hi, thank you. This is just a detailed question for Brittany. Actually, if you could just remind us, I didn't quite catch those expenses that are exempt from the spending threshold. Would you mind just repeating those?
Sure. So it's primarily our debt, related to eligible bonds. And then we also have some expenses related to Vermont State Teachers Retirement Program. It's not the expenses that, that teachers pay for, a portion of their pensions, but there is a cost that we incur for new teachers. I think it's around $1,300 a year, and we pay that into the pension. So that's exempt. And then there are some special education costs, the costs that are in excess of $60,000 for a student. And then all of those are per equalized pupil.
Grandma? Grandma?
Andy Hooper.
Got it. I was curious, so it sounds like next year we're likely to bump up against the double taxation threshold if we don't have fund balance to spend down our overall spending. I was wondering how we're situated among other school districts as far as that threshold. How many school districts are above the double taxation line at this point?
So I can speak to that, at least regionally. Superintendents in the CVSA region, that's the Addison, Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle. So all of those, and that's probably 2/3 of the students of Vermont too, because we're highly populated. We are the highest spender of all those districts, and we are the one district this year that's over the threshold of all those districts.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Barbara Wilson.
Hi there. Since we've reduced or eliminated pre-K in, I think it's Salisbury and Ripton for fiscal year 22, how is that going to work? Is there going to be, the state does authorize pre-K. I think it's 10 hours per week, correct?
Yeah.
So how does that work? So people understand what the implications are of not having the pre-K program, I think is my question.
Sure. So I'll start and then Peter can jump in if you want. So those students firstly would be eligible to attend another pre-K program in our district, like Mary Hogan or Bridport, if there was room. And then they also are eligible we would pay up to 10 hours a week, which is usually around $3,500 per student. That's set by the state. And they can attend a qualified partner program, essentially. We have a number of those like Mary Johnson and I think Corey Valley Children's Center. There's a pretty sizable list of partners, and parents can choose to enroll their children there, and we pay the providers directly for the portion of the 10 hours. And then we are able to count those students in our equalized pupils still.
In the equalized, okay. And the rationale for cutting the pre-K programs, just so everyone's clear, I think I know, but.
It was predominantly in looking at the staffing and enrollment. Ripton 4 or 5 students, I believe, and Salisbury, I believe, was lower than that. And so looking at having full-time staffing, looking at the availability in conversations with private providers about what's available for 3 and 4 year olds. Seemed like the right thing to do, as opposed to the other thing we could do is hire a full-time position. But looking at the scale, it didn't seem like that was a wise move, especially because Vermont has universal pre-K, and those families have access to programs throughout Vermont. We're not regionally bound, so if someone works in Burlington, they can take their student to Burlington and get that same funding.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Peter. I was going to say that the Ripton and Salisbury had a pre-KK mix, a blend. And so when the 6th grade moving, it shifted the blends a bit. So for example, at Ripton is a K1, a 2-3, and a 4-5. And so as Peter said, we were looking at, weighing having a full-time staff against some of the other factors that he mentioned.
Thank you.
Paige Pearson.
Hello, everybody. Sorry, my button didn't work. I just wanted, I may have missed, did Tanya's question get answered about, I guess I would ask it in a different way. Is there the ability, or does the current budget have positions broken out that are specifically IB related? I think that's what she was trying to get at. I may be wrong, but I'm just curious if there is.
Yeah, so the IB related positions, like the IB coordinators, are housed in the PD curriculum section of the budget, and they're also partially grant funded, so they'll show up in our consolidated federal program grants as well, a portion of them, and then the portion that's locally funded is contained in the professional development curriculum section of the budget.
Okay, so a person could look at the budget and kind of line item that out and figure that out if they needed to.
They could. I mean, one thing I would say,
yeah,
there are IB fees. So broken out in the budget book is IB fees and what those cost. If you're looking at, I know professional development was raised earlier. If you're looking at an IB cost as if we didn't do IB, we wouldn't have these costs. We would have other costs related to having an instructional coach or someone helping to facilitate teacher leadership around curriculum. So
yeah. Okay.
So it's a complex question in terms of what would completely go away if we weren't doing IB, what costs would completely be wiped off the books and wouldn't come back versus, IB is curriculum essentially. So
right.
we use the term IB, but it's a little bit more complex. I think we can legitimately say though that the fees that we pay would go away and those wouldn't be displaced by something else. So I think that the fees are the one thing that I think we can say, those are IB fees. We feel like they're supporting a lot of kind of strong work that comes into the district and supports a unified approach to teaching and learning.
Yeah.
Those would probably go away.
Okay. Thank you. I think that was helpful. Thanks so much.
Yep.
Other questions or comments? Anyone else? Well, if not, the other item on our ballot on March 2nd, of course, is the election of officers, school directors from Cornwall, Middlebury, and Shoreham. I'd be happy to invite anyone who's a candidate for one of those positions to say hello to the gang who's gathered this evening, if you would like to. You don't have to, but if you'd like to, be my guest. Chris.
Trying to lower my hand here. Hi, folks. Chris Kramer from Cornwall. I am currently the co-chair of Friends of Cornwall School, which I have done since the end of my son's kindergarten year. He's in second grade now. I have one son in second grade and I have a daughter in preschool who will be in kindergarten next year. So I've gotten the opportunity to try to co-run FOCS during the pandemic, pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, which has been an interesting challenge, but we've managed to do a lot. I think hopefully Heather would agree with that. We'll actually be serving a takeout dinner on town meeting day, which I can't credit myself for at all. Ian Ross is another Cornwallian who put that all together along with our chef, Dan Whittemore. That's one of the primary ways that I've been involved. I also have a background in finance. I have done a lot of finance related consulting to other types of public boards, not so much in education, but there are similar challenges. I work a lot in the energy field and they raise revenue through an energy charge. If you're familiar with Efficiency Vermont, you know what I'm talking about. And how much you can can use and spend that way and what the limitations are is an annual problem. And part of my job is to help public boards figure out how to use the limited resources they have in combination with other things to try to stretch the dollars that they're allocated. Those are my priorities for running for board. I think we need to really take a look at the MUMS restructuring and make sure the teachers are comfortable, and of course parents in the community are comfortable as well. There have been a lot of questions raised around that. So I think we need to get right on that because of the timing of that transition, with information going out already about how that'll all work. Certainly the pandemic recovery, we've heard a lot of discussion about that tonight. I'd be in favor of forming an ad hoc pandemic recovery committee, if that's something we could do, so that we can really focus our attention in on that. And then of course, future planning. We have taken a pause as a district on that discussion, but we will need to come back to it. I mean, you're hearing a lot of the financial challenges that we're facing, and they're very real. At the same time, I think that you've heard a number of folks even tonight mention some transparency related questions. And I think we need to bring both of those things to the table. We need to bring everybody together in hopefully an in-person, more informal setting for some good conversation around where to go. And we also need to commit to really being transparent about how we talk about what's real and what's not. And so I look forward to hopefully having an opportunity to increase my involvement and be part of that process. And I hope you'll consider me. Thank you very much.
Mary Heather?
Sorry, my picture was jumping around. I was having a hard time finding that unmute. I hope it's okay. All of us candidates received a message from Sharon Fletcher saying that we had 5 minutes to make our introductions, our pitch. I hope that's okay. I just want to make sure that's all right before I just read my prepared statement. So
That's what Sharon said.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So my name is Mary Heather Noble. I'm a resident of Middlebury, and I'm seeking one of the 2 Middlebury positions on the ACSD board. I'm a parent, a freelance writer, a former environmental regulator, and a community volunteer. I've been actively involved in the schools as a classroom volunteer, a reading mentor, coach, chaperone, fundraising volunteer, and among other things, an advocate for my own child's special education needs. I also served on the steering committee for this facilities master plan process with about a dozen other stakeholders, other parents, teachers, students, board members, and school administration. And together we designed and implemented the very first efforts at public engagement to try and communicate what the board was learning during its investigation of our facilities and gather the initial feedback from the community for the board's consideration as it continued that process. So I have 2 kids in the ACSD system, one at MUMS and one at MUHS, which means essentially that my kids are your kids' peers and that your children are classmates, teammates, and friends of my children's. We are one learning community. We have been one community and will be as long as all of our community schools send students to MUMS and MUHS for their secondary education. And since our children's learning is greatly influenced by their peers, I believe we have a shared responsibility to support the learning and enrichment of one another's children. So my interest in the ACSD board was first prompted by my own observations as a coach and a classroom volunteer. Many students in our district have complex needs that inhibit their ability to access their education. We all know we have students living in poverty. We have students who deal with the mental health impacts of family trauma or family addiction. And we have students who simply have learning differences. I certainly know firsthand how difficult it is to address those needs and how much extra work is placed on educators to provide for those kids, especially in schools with tight budgets. These are often the kids who fall through the cracks when budgets are cut, and these children are our children, and they're our children's peers. So I also know from my work on the steering committee about the significant disparities in classroom experiences between the different elementary schools across our district, and how our current configuration maintains those inequities. Our K through 12 student population, and that in Vermont in general, has decreased significantly over the last 25 years. And simply put, the ACSD no longer serves the number of students to justify its current spending. So with our equity concerns and our demographic concerns, and the fact that 80% of ACSD's budget is spent on staffing and fixed facility costs, including 7 elementary schools operating significantly below capacity, I believe that the district has no choice but to evaluate the efficacy of this configuration in its facilities planning process. And in fact, it's the current response to this process that's motivated me to run for the board. So over the past 2 years, I've witnessed, and we've all witnessed, a breakdown in communication, one that the steering committee initially feared. I've seen people focus on positions rather than their problems, and dismiss the grave financial challenges we will face as a district, and we currently face as a district, as well as the truly legitimate concerns that people have about closing their school. I've seen the conversation about education really narrowly focused on grades K through 6, with little regard for the impact of our budget issues on MUMS and MUHS. And I've heard arguments about small schools being better than large schools, which when you really consider the fact that all of our schools are considered small in the broader picture, it feels a little bit like saying very small families are better than larger families, when the truth is both and everything in between can be great for kids as long as they're well supported. And for ACSD, that requires financial stability. So I'll close with this. The sustainability of our community schools was an issue before we unified as a district. It is a statewide problem. We see it happening all over us, or all around us, and it's a problem that won't go away on its own. So my goal as a prospective board member is to help the district enhance its two-way communication with our learning community, so that we can arrive at a common understanding of our district's challenges and commit collectively to the important work of finding solutions that prioritize student success, equity, and financial responsibility. I truly believe we can find creative ways to maintain community as we seek that point of intersection between best practices in education, equity, and financial stability. I hope I can earn your vote. Thank you for the opportunity.
Davina DeMary. You can correct my pronunciation, Davina.
That's okay, Governor. It's Damery, but that's not a problem. I'm used to it being mispronounced. So Davina Damery, I am running for my second term on the board. I live here in Middlebury, have been in Middlebury for about 10 years now. I have a 6th grader who has attended Mary Hogan for her entire school career. I have been in education up until the last 5 years, where I'm now in restorative justice. And my hope is to be able to continue my opportunity to finish, or to maybe not, if we get to the point of finishing these projects, these goals that the board has, to be able to continue and grow with the board in those projects. Thank you.
Lindsay Hescock.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lindsay Hescock. I live in East Middlebury. I've lived in Addison County for almost 20 years now. My son goes to Mary Hogan and is a third grader there. And if all things go as planned, I would hope that he would be in the district for the duration of his schooling. And I am really passionate about this, talk a lot about it. And I just saw an opportunity to become more involved in the process. And I feel like it's a really great example to set for my son to get involved in things that that mean a lot to you, that give you a chance to make a difference and have your voice heard. And I also prioritize advocacy, and I get the sense that there are a lot of voices not being heard, or we hear them and then they just echo. You know, so we talk, there's a lot of buzzwords about equity and, but I think that the existing board members have done a lot of hard work, but there's a long road ahead. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in Connecticut, but I have deep roots in Vermont all my life. I've visited family up here, moved here about 20 years ago. I'm a parent and a volunteer. I've volunteered in the classroom since my son started kindergarten with MESA. I've done a lot of work in schools as a volunteer, and also in special education programs and doing enrichment programs. Many people know me from teaching classes in the community, teaching gymnastics. I've done work in hospitality and program development, and I work in a local Eastview. So people know me wearing a lot of different hats, and I'd like you to get to know me as a positive, a person contributing positively to this process, asking good questions and trying to find creative solution to what, in some ways seems like almost impossible problems when it comes to sustainability and this communication transparency issue that not everyone, but a lot of people talk about it. So the issues at hand, everyone talks about them, the 6th grade move and what that's going to look like, getting to the other side of COVID, this facilities master plan, and the way in which it's been happening. And we have, a lot of work still to do. The budget, I'm getting questions about, what is my stance on SROs in the school, about IB, that nobody seems to be able to get a line item breakdown of the real costs, not just the positions, but the curriculum fees, training, the displays that are required and the entryways, that kind of stuff. So that's just one example. And I agree with Mary Heather about the K through 12 focus, that we do focus a lot on the elementary schools right now, but we have the spectrum, from pre-K through 12, and in our special education programs, we have students in their early 20s who are still benefiting from the programs. And we have a lot of families and students who rely on the education system to provide far more than just learning math and reading. It's really a family that, we have our nurses, brushing out people's hair in the morning and doing the laundry, because that's just what needs to be done. We have these amazing educators, and I don't really hear a lot of those voices, the families, the students, the educators, the other staff in the schools. So I'm hoping to learn a lot more about what has been done to date, and about the taxes and the budget. Not just the pros of consolidation, but the real costs, including transportation, the cons of consolidation. And so I hope you all go out to vote on town meeting day, or request your ballot. I believe that for Middlebury, the last day to request your ballot is on Thursday. So please contact your town clerk and make sure that you have the opportunity to vote. If you have questions for me, please reach out. lindsayhescock@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook as well. I'm happy to get to know people, answer questions, and I'm pretty open-minded. I'd like to learn more about this. So thank you very much for your time. And this has been a great meeting to be a part of.
Barbara Wilson.
Excellent. Can you hear me? My name is Barbara Wilson, and my husband and I moved to Shoreham about almost 13 years ago. And at that time, I actually worked remote, while at the same time I started up my little farm, Solar Haven Farm, and I can often be found selling my products at the Middlebury Farmers Market. Just a little bit about me. I grew up on a small family-owned dairy farm in Michigan. And through that experience, I learned firsthand what it was like to grow up in a household who was struggling financially and unfortunately with a mom suffering from mental illness. So I know the impact that had as a child going through school. I also experienced what it was like to be labeled as a low performer when I moved from my one-room elementary country school, yes, one room, to middle school. And thanks to a special math teacher who recognized that I was assigned to the wrong place, made sure that I was put my schedule all totally reworked. And as a result of that, I ended up graduating second in my class in high school. And with the help of scholarships and financial aid and working, I was able to graduate from Michigan State with honors and with a dual degree in mathematics and secondary education. I worked for a large software corporation for 38 years where I managed the business, financial, and technical aspects of a very large software product that had an annual revenue stream of upwards of 25 to 30 million per year. I also then witnessed firsthand the frustration of my stepson who was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and he was struggling in 10th grade, in middle school with math once you had to start showing your work. And I was able to successfully help him conquer that difficulty, and fortunately had a mom whose specialty was special education and a principal who ensured he also had the tools that he needed to succeed. And he now is a naval architect with a PhD in computational fluid dynamics, more math than I would ever begin to be able to deal with. In 2018, I ran for Addison Rutland State Rep. And though I lost, I learned so much by knocking on hundreds and hundreds of doors, speaking with rural Vermonters living in my district, which has given me a very good perspective of, some of the special needs and helping me to understand that, I don't necessarily know the issues unless I talk to them and we dialogue with folks of what their struggles are, and we need to make sure that we're engaging those individuals in the conversation. I believe because of this, I have a real unique background that would really help the district better understand our rural communities and their unique needs. I also have decades of experience in team management, fiscal plan development, assessment, and accountability. Just over about a year ago, I attended my first ACSD board meeting, which was held in Shoreham. Until then, I was totally unaware that Shoreham's enrollment had grown 40% over the last 5 years. I was also extremely impressed with the number of young families and parents who attended and how articulately they spoke about why they moved to Shoreham and how important that the rural school was to their children. Based on this experience, I decided to invest my expertise and time to perform in-depth enrollment, financial, social, economic assessments of each of the consolidation models presented by the board. This involved attending every board meeting and facilities master plan committee meeting. I also reviewed many of the recordings that took place before I got involved. A few weeks before the pandemic shut down, I had the opportunity to join the principal in doing reading sessions with the second graders where they would come and read to my dog Java at a time. And though we had to stop doing that process, it really gave me insight on the disparity in reading abilities that are available, that are there. And I've since done some research on that and realized that this is a statewide problem, that our literacy is actually declining, especially for our most vulnerable children. I have a passion for ensuring that that district decisions result in equitable outcomes for all our students, regardless of where they live. This includes the special needs of our most vulnerable students living in our rural areas. I believe with my background, I can help our board with a better understanding of some of the educational differences that exist when it comes to our rural students, and most importantly, to help ensure that our vulnerable children are not left behind. I will use my strong research and analytical skills to help ensure that our decisions are based on concrete, financial, and social economic assessments, including anticipated benefits and liabilities. And I will also use my years of business and customer experience to work towards a shared district vision that includes measurable goals and outcomes, major decisions that are made based on upfront defined criteria with objective measurable outcomes, the appropriate level of supporting analytical data, and public input and collaboration. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to serving on the ACS board. You can learn more about me by going to barbwilsonacsdboard.com. Thanks much.
Peter Conlon.
Thank you very much, Governor, and thank you to everybody who's turned out tonight. We had over 100 people show up at tonight's meeting. I wasn't expecting that, and I think it continues to show a great public interest in what we're doing. My name is Peter Conlon. My wife Mary and I have lived in Cornwall for 30 years. We've raised 3 sons who went through the ACSD system, and we're currently foster parents to a student at the high school and the Hannaford Career Center. I'm seeking re-election to the board. I've been a member since we were created 5 years ago, served the first 4 years as chair, and I'm currently chair of our negotiations team. I hope to bring that experience and my experience previously on the UD3 board back to the board. I think Mary Heather really eloquently sort of framed the issues that we're facing. And I hope my experience will help us face, the new challenges of learning recovery following the coronavirus pandemic, our continued ongoing challenges with declining enrollment and increasing costs. And within that, being able to seek new opportunities to continue to make this district really a place of educational excellence that is at the same time providing a really good value to taxpayers. Thank you. And I look forward to having everybody turn out and vote. That's the most important thing.
Well, thank you all. Ordinarily at this meeting, as you know, we elect our clerk, treasurer, and moderator, but because everything is different this year, those are on the Australian ballot as well. Linda Barrett is our clerk. She's with us tonight. Michelle Warren is our treasurer. And I'm happy to have them say hello if they'd like or not. They're not jumping at the opportunity. Well,
if they could raise their hand, then I can find them more easily and unmute them.
Well, Linda's just choosing to wave, I think, and
oh, there she is.
Yeah, and Michelle is on.
Okay, so I'm Linda Barrett. My husband Leonard and I lived 40 years in Bridport, where we're farmers, and raised 4 children. I was originally from Weybridge, and we recently have moved back to Weybridge. So now I have another hometown. I am an employee at the Bridport Central School and have been for 30 years. I have also been clerk of the UD3 and ACSD since 2006 and took on the Hannaford Center clerk's position in 2017. So I'm interested in continuing, and I've always had an interest in being involved in the town and school government and budgets and whatever else goes on. So I've done minutes for the high school and both of these boards and like to continue. Thank you.
You've had it easy tonight, Linda. You didn't have to check voters off as we came into the room.
That's true. No checklists at all today.
Well, thanks. Michelle?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, my name's Michelle Warren. I live in Bridport with my husband, Eric. We have two boys, one who has graduated from Middlebury High School, and my youngest is a junior. I am working at the National Bank of Middlebury. I've been there for 19 years. 17 of those years have been in the finance department, where my primary position was accounts payable. I currently work with our correspondent banks, maintaining the account balances, making sure that we comply with reserve requirements. I reconcile accounts. I file monthly, quarterly, and annual tax returns. We also manage the investment portfolio, and I administer shareholder relations for our holding company. I've been the treasurer since 2008, back when it was ACSU. I've developed a wonderful working relationship with the staff at central office, ensuring that I'm always available for any assistance that's required of this position, whether it's signing just the normal accounts payable checks, payroll, an urgent check, placing stop payments on checks, and helping to request draws on our line of credit. I have a degree in early education. I'm graduated magna cum laude from Champlain College. I am constantly trying to further my education. I'm working towards an accounting certificate through the bank, through the Center for Financial Training. I'm actually enrolling in another self-study class right now, so that leaves 2 before that certificate is actually realized. One really interesting thing is I'm able to use my degree in education with National Bank of Middlebury. I help the bank bring a schoolhouse savings program into some of the rural schools. So 2 of the 4 elementary schools I am the bank representative for. And each student comes into a designated place, and they deposit their pennies or their dollars or checks from holidays or birthdays, and I bring it back to the bank and I deposit it into their accounts for them, trying to help build their financial literacy at a very young age. It's very important to do that. So I thank you for your consideration in me continuing in this position. I look forward to providing further assistance, servicing ACSD, the community, and everybody involved. Thank you.
And quickly, Jim Douglas from Middlebury. Our kids went through the Middlebury schools, K through 12, and given the disadvantage they have with their parental supervision, it was obviously their education that made them into the successful and brilliant adults they are today. So we're grateful to ACSD. Well, anything else to come before our hearing tonight? That concludes the items that we had on our agenda. Molly Witters.
Hi, I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm Molly Witters, a parent from Ripton, Vermont, and also the town moderator. So I really enjoy watching you run the show, Mr. Douglas, Governor Douglas. You're professional in that way. And I guess I'm bringing to the table just a call for to the whole board for maybe a shift in your democratic agenda or democratic comport over the next few years. And Mary Heather Noble, when you were speaking about being part of the group that wrote the Articles of Agreement, it did raise my hairs a little bit, because there had been a good number of us who felt fairly disenfranchised by these Articles of Agreement, and in fact brought 2 petitions to have them changed, which gained over 800 signatures, with which the board refused to bring to a vote last year. And so what I am encouraging you to do in your future boards, because I know you guys are doing hard work and incredible work on a lot of levels, is to maybe just keep checking in with yourself about how the little guy might feel, and how we can have a voice in a scenario where we actually don't have a democratic voice right now. And so this takes its own level of work when you've already got a lot of work on your plate, but it's certainly resulted in Ripton's efforts to departure at this point. Had we had a more democratic system on this board, I think we could have done a better job in finding middle ground with one another. So I think it's going to take a a big sea change on a board to be willing to kind of do that inward work and maybe look at who's leading and look at who's listening and swap some of those people. And that's my encouragement as a citizen, still as part of the district, perhaps until March 2nd. Thank you very much for your time.
Steve Cash.
Thank you. I was just getting waiting to get unmuted. Thank you, Governor, for everyone here tonight. Really appreciate the fact that we had over 100 people here tonight. I think that speaks highly of this entire district. My name is Steve Cash. I live in Ripton. I'm here tonight on behalf of the group Save Our Schools, or SOS. The statement is similar to one that SOS has shared at each in-town informational meeting that has been held so far in the district. On January 12th, Ripton residents voted by a significant majority, 163 to 107, to leave the Addison Central School District. This came after almost 2 years of advocacy that at the time were not directed at leaving the district, but at being heard and empowered in the decision-making processes within the school district. Tonight I am here with a simple message. We hope that you, as fellow Vermonters, will respect that our town has already voted to leave the district by a large majority. We hope that you will trust that we have weighed and investigated the impacts of this choice on our children and our community. We are not asking you to decide if this is morally or even functionally right for our town. We have already democratically made that decision. Your task is to ask how that departure might affect your town. With that in mind, I want to take a moment to discuss the most potential consequential impact this decision could have on your community: taxes. Fortunately for other towns in the district, because Ripton is so small and because our cost per pupil is in fact amongst the highest in the district, our leaving will likely have a tax neutral effect on other towns. On the other hand, Ripton being forced to stay in the district could theoretically save you marginally more in taxes. But I beg to ask you what that marginal savings at the expense of a neighbor's democratically chosen wishes is really worth. I have been extremely heartened in talking to so many people around the district over the past couple of weeks. We are feeling an overwhelming sense of support from many in the district, and so much of it comes down to us sharing common values. We believe in local democracy. We believe in the importance of small towns in defining our state values, and we believe in supporting one another. In Ripton, we want to keep our young children close. We want to keep our community vibrant and for it to continue to be a place where working families choose to move. Please recognize the passion we have for our town and our school with a yes vote to ratify Ripton's vote to leave ACSD. Thank you.
Mary Heather.
Yes, thank you. I just want to take a quick opportunity to offer a point of clarification to Molly Witter's comment. I'm not really sure. I just want to clarify that the steering committee that I served on was not involved in creating any articles of agreement. It was more of an informal steering committee with representatives from all the different stakeholders. So I was a parent, there were a few other parents, there were teachers, community members, board members, folks from administration, basically folks all from different aspects of the decision making to come together to talk about what's going to be the best way to present the data that the board has been looking at, what's going to be the best way to gather our community together, how are we going to advertise those efforts. So I just want to clarify that I personally wasn't involved in the articles of agreement. I suspect that's something else that you're talking about. So, and I understand your point. Just want to make that clarification that did not involve the steering committee. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions tonight? Well, if not, I want to thank Brittany for her presentation and responses. I want to thank Peter for facilitating the technology that I certainly couldn't have done on my own. And thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to be with us for the informational hearing tonight. And as several have said throughout the evening, be sure to vote on or before March 2nd so that we have a maximum expression of the opinions of the people of our district. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening.